Most men are judged by what they did in their youth. He was judged by what age finally forced him to face. For most of his life, he treated black people as property, not quietly, not reluctantly, but as part of a world he believed was permanent. The law supported him. The land rewarded him. The people around him benefited from his silence. Years passed. Systems changed. Power moved on. What stayed behind was a man who had lived long enough to understand that cruelty does not need anger to exist, only permission. The house where he spent his final years had been built to impress visitors, not to comfort the man who would one day die inside it. Long hallways stretched farther than necessary. Doors were tall, heavy, and slow to close. Sound carried in ways that made even small movements feel exposed. When the wind pressed against the structure, it did not howl. It sighed as if tired of repeating itself. He spent most mornings seated near the window, facing land that once answered to his name. From a distance, the fields still looked orderly. Fences remained. Paths cut clean lines through the earth. Time had softened their edges, but it had not erased them. Prosperity has a way of leaving behind convincing illusions. Up close, there was very little left. His hands no longer rested easily. They trembled when he lifted them, hesitated when they reached for objects. He had handled without thought for decades. Age had introduced him to delays, waiting for strength, waiting for balance, waiting for breath. These pauses unsettled him more than pain ever had. There had been a time when he never waited. In his youth, mornings followed a predictable rhythm. He would step onto the porch as the day assembled itself below him. People gathered, not in disorder, not in conversation, but in readiness, heads lowered, movements careful. Silence arrived before he spoke. He did not demand it. He expected it. At the time, none of this felt excessive. Authority was the environment he had grown up in. Like weather, it was simply there. He did not invent the system. He inherited it, along with the land, the ledgers, and the confidence that came with knowing the world had already been arranged in his favor. The books mattered to him. They were proof. Names, ages, valuations recorded in careful handwriting. Human lives flattened into entries that could be totaled, taxed, insured. When he first added a name of his own to those pages, he remembered the steadiness of his hand, no hesitation, no sense of crossing a line. Why would there have been? Everyone he respected had done these. Same fathers, uncles, neighbors, men, who spoke of responsibility and order, as if those words explained everything. Ownership in that world was not a moral question. It was an economic one. He learned early that cruelty was not defined by harm, but by inefficiency. Hurt that reduced productivity was wasteful. Discipline that increased output was praised. He absorbed these lessons without resistance, because they rewarded him immediately. He did not think of himself as hateful. Hatred required effort. Hatred suggested chaos. What he practiced was far cleaner than that. He believed in distance, in roles, in boundaries that allowed him to sleep without interruption. Black people to him were not enemies. They were resources. That distinction mattered deeply to his self-image. It allowed him to believe he was rational, even fair. He provided food, shelter, structure. In return, he expected obedience. When obedience failed, correction followed. This was how order was maintained. Over time, he grew skilled at not noticing certain things. The way shoulders tensed before he spoke. The way conversations stopped when he approached. The way eyes followed the ground rather than his face. These details existed at the edges of his awareness, acknowledged only long enough to be dismissed. Acknowledgement would have required reflection. Reflection would have threatened stability. So he focused on results, on yields, on reputation. Other men spoke well of him. Business partners trusted him. Officials respected his reliability. When he looked at his life, he saw success confirmed by those whose opinions mattered to him. The others, the ones whose labor built that success, remained voiceless by design. Change did not announce itself loudly at first. It never does. It arrives as conversation, as rumor, as the distant sound of disagreement. He heard talk of pressure from outside the region, of growing discomfort among people who did not understand how things were. He dismissed it as noise. Laws, he believed, were shaped by those with something to lose, He had plenty to lose. That gave him confidence. What he did not notice was how confidence had begun to age. Younger men spoke differently, not boldly but cautiously. They asked questions he had never needed to ask. Some left. Others stayed but no longer looked at him the same way. The land continued to produce, but the atmosphere had shifted. Authority still existed, but it felt rehearsed, as though everyone were playing a part they knew would not last. By the time the system finally gave way, he was already old enough to mistake inevitability for betrayal. The day-to-day consequences unfolded slowly. People left when they could. Others moved through the work without attachment. The routines he had enforced for decades began to unravel, not through rebellion, but through absence. Silence replaced structure. Fields grew quieter. The house, once alive with movement he never acknowledged, began to empty. At first he told himself this was temporary. Transitions always felt uncomfortable. Stability would return in a new form. It always did. Years passed. Stability did not. Age crept forward, indifferent to his expectations. Strength faded. Illness visited and lingered. Tasks he once performed without thought became negotiations with his own body. He hired help when he could, but it was not the same. There was no shared history, no unspoken understanding built on fear and dependence. He noticed the difference, though he did not name it. There were moments now, quiet, unwelcome moments, when memory surfaced without permission. Not grand scenes, not dramatic confrontations, but fragments. A look held too long, a pause after an order, a woman who met his eyes once instead of lowering hers. He remembered the irritation he had felt then. Not anger exactly, disruption. She had broken the rhythm of his authority by acknowledging herself. He had turned away, dismissing her as an inconvenience. That memory returned often in his final years. It arrived without context, without explanation, and refused to leave. The realization that followed was slow, almost reluctant. Cruelty, he began to understand, was not always loud. It did not require raised voices or visible violence. It could exist entirely within routine, protected by habit and approval. It could look like paperwork, like silence, like turning away. As the world narrowed around him, the moral certainty he had relied on began to collapse, not because anyone accused him, there was no audience left for that, but because there was nothing left to distract him from his own thoughts. He had lived a long life, longer than many, long enough to watch the foundations of his world disappear, long enough to realize that survival was not the same as victory. In the evenings, as shadows stretched across the floor, he sat without turning on the lamps. Darkness no longer bothered him. He had grown accustomed to it. What unsettled him was the clarity that accompanied it. For decades he had believed that success excused everything, that being on the winning side of history meant never having to explain oneself. Only now did he understand the cost of that belief. Time had taken his strength. Change had taken his authority. What remained was understanding, arriving far too late to be useful, and that more than anything else was the punishment he had never expected. The days began to lose their edges. Morning no longer arrived with purpose. It came quietly, without urgency, as if unsure whether he was still expecting it. He woke later than he once had, not because he slept deeply, but because there was no reason to rise. The body decides its own schedule when the world stops asking for it. He noticed small humiliations first, buttons that refused to cooperate, boots that required sitting, a hand that reached for support before pride could stop it. These moments irritated him in ways he did not admit out loud. Irritation had once been a tool, now it was pointless. There had been a time when the house responded to him. A chair pulled back before he reached it. A door opened before he touched the handle. A glass filled before he felt thirst. None of these acts had felt extraordinary then. They were simply the background noise of authority. Now the house waited for him instead. It did nothing unless he did first. He walked the rooms more often than he needed to, as if movement itself could keep something at bay. The floors remembered footsteps that no longer existed. In certain corridors he still slowed instinctively, expecting to encounter someone just beyond the turn. The absence surprised him every time. Memory, he discovered, was not loyal to sequence. It did not present itself neatly. nor did it ask permission. It arrived as sensation more than image. The smell of dust warmed by sun, the scrape of wood against stone, the weight of eyes on his back. In the early years he had enjoyed being watched. It had reassured him. Attention confirmed importance. Fear confirmed relevance. When people adjusted their posture at his approach, when voices lowered, when movement became cautious, he felt the quiet satisfaction of control. Order was visible. Authority was tangible. He had mistaken that reaction for respect. Only much later did he understand that respect, given under threat, does not survive the removal of power. It dissolves the moment fear no longer needs to perform. There were moments now when he imagined footsteps behind him, not close enough to touch him, not fast enough to catch him, just present. When he turned, there was nothing. The sensation lingered anyway, as if the past were checking whether he still noticed it. He had never considered how many people had spent their lives aware of his presence in exactly that way. The ledgers remained stored in a cabinet he rarely opened. The lock still worked. The key still turned. One afternoon, driven by restlessness rather than intention, he opened the doors and pulled a book free. The pages were brittle. Ink had faded where fingers had rested too often. Names filled the lines, hundreds of them, some marked with notes, some crossed out, some altered, corrected, reassigned. He had once been proud of these records. They represented efficiency, growth, proof of competence. Now they felt heavy in his hands. He searched for nothing in particular, letting the pages fall where they would. Ages jumped out at him, 12, 15, 22. He paused longer than expected on the younger ones. He could not remember their faces. That disturbed him more than he anticipated. He had known them once. He must have. He had spoken their names, issued instructions, passed judgment. And yet, faced with the evidence of their existence, he felt nothing recognizable as connection. The realization unsettled him, not because he missed them, but because he could not summon even the memory of missing. What kind of life erases people so completely? He closed the book and returned it to the cabinet, locking it again with more force than necessary. The sound echoed. For a brief moment he wondered whether anyone would hear it. The thought passed quickly. Outside, the land endured without him. Seasons continued their quiet rotation. Fences fell and were replaced. New owners nearby made improvements he would never have approved. Their methods irritated him at first. Later, he stopped noticing. Relevance once lost rarely announces its departure. He attended fewer gatherings as the years went on. Conversations exhausted him. The world spoke a language that no longer felt directed at him. When people mentioned the past, it was not his past they referred to. It was a version already edited, summarized, judged. He recognized his own life in fragments of other people's sentences and did not like what he heard. At home, evenings stretched longer than they used to. He ate less. Food tasted flatter. Hunger arrived late and left early. There was a sense, increasingly difficult to ignore, that his body was preparing to leave before he was ready to follow. It was during one of these evenings that a memory returned with unusual clarity. A boy, no older than 16, standing near the edge of the field. The workday was nearly over. The sun sat low. Dust hung in the air. The boy's shoulders sagged with exhaustion. He was too young to carry. He remembered issuing an order. Not cruel, not kind, routine. The boy had hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. He had not shouted. He had not struck him himself. He had simply nodded once. Others understood what that nod meant. Consequences followed efficiently. At the time, he had turned away before it was finished. Discipline did not require observation. Results were sufficient. Now seated in the dim quiet of his house, he realized he had never once wondered what became of that boy afterward, whether he healed, whether he endured, whether he carried that moment forward into the rest of his life. The question arrived too late to matter to anyone but him. This was how regret began, not as pain but as interruption, a crack in the certainty he had relied on for decades. He found himself revisiting moments he had once considered insignificant. Each memory arrived stripped of context, no longer protected by justification. He tried briefly to defend himself. He reminded himself of the times he had withheld punishment, the days he had allowed rest, the families he had kept together rather than selling apart. These thoughts comforted him for a while. Then another realization followed. Mercy offered by someone who owns another person is still control. That thought stayed with him longer than he liked. He began to notice how often he had confused restraint with virtue, how easily he had accepted praise for not being worse, rather than questioning why he had been allowed to be anything at all. Sleep grew restless. Dreams arrived uninvited, heavy with sensation but light on narrative. Faces appeared without names. Voices spoke without words. He woke disoriented, his heart racing for reasons he could not articulate. During the day, he moved more slowly, not just physically, but mentally. Thought required effort now. Reflection demanded energy he was reluctant to spend, and yet avoidance no longer worked. Silence had become too accommodating. The world outside had no interest in his internal reckoning. Time did not pause to observe his discomfort. People lived, argued, advanced, and forgot. His story had already been filed away by others. What remained was his own attention, turned inward at last. One afternoon, a storm passed through the area with little warning. Rain struck the windows sharply, then softened into steady insistence. He watched it without moving, reminded of other storms he had ignored because they did not inconvenience him directly. The land absorbed the water without complaint. So had the people for a very long time. He understood now that endurance is not consent, that silence is not agreement, that survival does not mean acceptance. These truths seemed obvious in isolation. Together they formed an indictment he could no longer deflect. The thought did not make him weep. Tears would have been easier. Instead, it settled into him as weight, permanent, unforgiving. He had lived believing that power protected him from consequence. That age would soften judgment. That history would blur responsibility. What age had given him instead was clarity. And what history had removed was the audience he might have spoken to. There was no one left to convince. No one left to explain himself to. The only witness remaining was the one he had avoided his entire life, himself. As night fell, he remained seated, listening to the rain diminish until it became background noise again. Another day completed, another step closer to an ending he could not negotiate. He did not fear death. What unsettled him was the knowledge that understanding had arrived without forgiveness and without the possibility of repair, and it was going to stay with him. Time no longer moved forward in a straight line for him. It folded back on itself, looping through places he had avoided, pausing where he once hurried past. Days blended together, but certain memories sharpened, as if age were polishing them instead of dulling them. He stopped marking the calendar. At first he had done it out of habit, a pencil line through each passing day, a small assertion that time was still something he could track. Eventually the marks felt meaningless. The days did not differ enough to justify the effort. Morning light, silence. Evening shadow, silence again. What changed was not the routine, but what occupied his mind while he moved through it. He began to notice how often his thoughts returned to moments where he had chosen ease over reflection, decisions made quickly, orders given without explanation, silence accepted as confirmation. He had once believed decisiveness was a virtue. Now he wondered how often it had simply been avoidance. There was a particular room he rarely entered anymore. It sat at the far end of the house, smaller than the others, less grand. For years it had been used for storage. Old furniture, broken tools, things that no longer served a purpose, but had not yet been discarded. One afternoon, driven by a restlessness he could not name, he opened the door. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by the intrusion. The smell was stale, familiar. He stepped inside carefully, his movements cautious, as though the room might object to his presence. Light filtered in through a narrow window, revealing shapes and outlines without detail. He recognized a chair immediately. It was plain, wooden, worn smooth by use. One leg had been repaired long ago with a darker piece of wood. He remembered the repair. He had approved it himself, annoyed that the chair had broken in the first place. Waste irritated him. Replacement was cheaper than reflection. The chair had not been for him. He stood there longer than he intended to, staring at it as though it might speak. Instead, it offered only memory, not of a specific person, but of a role. Someone waiting, someone listening, someone absorbing words they were never meant to answer. He felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest and stepped back, closing the door with more care than necessary. In his younger years, he had prided himself on efficiency. He moved through life quickly, decisively, with little tolerance for delay. Slowness to him suggested weakness. Hesitation implied doubt, and doubt was dangerous. Now slowness defined him. He moved carefully through the house, through his thoughts, through the few remaining interactions he had with others. Conversations were brief, polite, distant. People spoke to him as one speaks to something fragile, unsure how much pressure it can withstand. This too unsettled him. He had never considered how it felt to be managed. The loss of control arrived in layers. First physical, then social, finally psychological. He found himself anticipating disappointment before it arrived, adjusting expectations downward without conscious effort. This self-editing disturbed him more than anger ever had. He began to understand how much of his confidence had been borrowed from the environment around him. When that environment changed, the confidence evaporated. There were moments when he tried to reconstruct his old certainty. He revisited the arguments he had once relied on: tradition, necessity, stability. He examined them carefully, as though searching for cracks. They did not hold. Tradition, he realized, explained longevity, not righteousness. Necessity had always been defined by those who benefited from it. Stability, when maintained through suffering, was simply stagnation with better branding. These thoughts did not arrive dramatically. They did not demand attention. They accumulated quietly, forming a weight that pressed against him. Even in moments of distraction, he began to speak less, even when others were present. Words felt dangerous now, not because they might offend, but because they might reveal something he was no longer prepared to defend. In the evenings, he sometimes sat without any light at all. Darkness simplified things. It removed detail. It reduced the world to shape and sound. He found comfort in that reduction. It reminded him of how he had once simplified people, not as individuals, but as categories. Labor, property, expense, risk, simplification had made everything manageable. It had allowed him to make decisions without consequence, or at least without awareness of consequence. He wondered how many lives had been lived in response to his convenience. The question followed him into sleep. Dreams grew more vivid, less symbolic. They did not disguise themselves as metaphor. They replayed scenes with uncomfortable clarity. Fields at dusk, voices carried by wind, the sound of breathing in the dark. He often woke with the sense that he had been observed. This sensation irritated him at first. He reminded himself that he was alone, that the house was empty, that no one remained to watch him. Logic dismissed the feeling, but logic no longer governed his reactions. He began to understand that the presence he felt was memory itself, finally uncontained. During one of his infrequent trips into town, he overheard a conversation he was not meant to join. Two younger men spoke casually about the past, about stories they had heard growing up. His name surfaced briefly, stripped of detail, reduced to a reference point. They did not speak with anger. They did not speak with reverence. They spoke as though discussing weather patterns or old buildings. He listened without turning. That indifference struck him harder than condemnation would have. He had expected judgment, criticism, perhaps even hostility. What he encountered instead was irrelevance. His life, once central to so many others, had become an anecdote. On the drive home, he felt an unfamiliar sense of displacement, not physical but existential, as though he had outlived the version of himself that mattered. The house greeted him with its usual quiet. He moved through it slowly, touching the backs of chairs, the edges of tables. These objects had witnessed everything. They bore marks of use, of impact, of age. They did not accuse. They did not absolve. They simply remained. He sat down heavily, more tired than the day justified. Fatigue settled into his bones, deeper than physical exhaustion. It felt cumulative, as though it carried the weight of years rather than hours. He considered writing something. A record, an explanation. The idea had surfaced more than once. Words on paper felt safer than words spoken. They could be controlled, revised, contained. He never followed through. What would he write exactly? An apology addressed to no one? A justification no longer accepted? A confession without consequence? Each possibility felt inadequate, even dishonest. He realized then that his silence had not ended. It had merely changed shape. Before it had been a tool of power. Now it was a refuge from accountability. That recognition did not free him. It burdened him further. He began to notice how often his thoughts circled the same realization. Understanding had arrived too late to alter anything meaningul. The people affected by his actions were gone from his reach, if not from existence. The system he had relied upon had collapsed without asking his permission. The future moved forward without him. All that remained was awareness, unaccompanied by remedy. He found himself wondering whether ignorance had been a mercy after all, whether knowing without the ability to repair was a harsher fate. The thought lingered unresolved. As night settled in, he sat listening to the house settle around him. Wood contracting, pipes adjusting, the quiet mechanics of a structure, aging alongside its occupant. He thought of all the years he had believed himself immune to consequence, of how confidently he had mistaken endurance for innocence, of how rarely he had allowed himself to imagine the interior lives of those beneath him. Age had stripped away many things: strength, status, certainty. What it had left him with was the one thing he had spent a lifetime avoiding: uninterrupted attention to what he had been. He closed his eyes not to sleep, but to rest from resisting the thought. It did not go away. The body begins to betray its owner in subtle ways before it makes its intentions clear. It hesitates. It forgets. It fails without warning, then pretends nothing happened. He noticed this first in his legs. They tired faster than they used to, not from distance, but from standing still. Balance, once automatic, now demanded attention. He adapted the way he always had. A chair placed closer to the door. A cane kept within reach. Movements measured rather than assumed. Adaptation had been one of his strengths. It was how he had survived change before. This time it felt different. Adaptation now required humility, a trait he had never cultivated. Asking for help unsettled him. Even when assistance was offered freely, it carried a sting. Dependence felt like a violation, not of dignity but of identity. He had defined himself for so long as the one who did not need. There were days when he resented his own body for this weakness, as if it had betrayed an unspoken agreement. He had given it work, discipline, restraint. In return, he had expected loyalty. The body did not negotiate. Pain arrived inconsistently. Some mornings were manageable. Others demanded surrender before they even began. He learned to read the signals, to anticipate the limits, to stop just short of failure. Pride insisted on pushing further. Experience warned against it. He listened to experience now. In these slower days, he found himself thinking about illness, not his own, but the way sickness had once been treated under his authority. Weakness had never been an excuse. If a body could not perform, it was a problem to be managed. Accommodations were temporary. Compassion was conditional. Those who could not keep pace fell behind. Those who fell behind were forgotten. He had not invented this logic. He had enforced it. The realization sat with him longer than he liked. A neighbor visited occasionally, more out of obligation than connection. The conversations were polite, careful, weather, property lines, news that no longer surprised him. He noticed how the neighbor avoided certain topics, how pauses stretched where honesty might have entered. He understood why. He had once benefited from that same caution. After one such visit, he sat alone, replaying the exchange. He realized that nothing had been said that required remembering. The conversation had existed to fill space, not to create meaning. He wondered how many interactions in his life had functioned the same way. Filling space had always been easier than confronting it. At night, sleep grew thinner. He woke frequently, disoriented, his body unsure whether it was morning or evening. In those moments, he lay still, listening to his own breathing. Each breath sounded deliberate, effortful, as though his lungs were performing a task rather than participating in life. He remembered other nights long ago, when the sounds that filled the darkness had not been his own, coughing from another room, shifting bodies settling onto hard surfaces, quiet movements meant to avoid attention. He had slept through those sounds without interruption. Now the silence pressed back. He began to speak aloud when alone. Not often, just fragments, observations, questions that went unanswered. The sound of his own voice startled him at first. It had grown unused to being heard without response. There was no comfort in these words, only acknowledgement. One afternoon, he attempted to walk farther than usual, drawn by a sense of obligation he could not name. The path beyond the house curved gently, bordered by land that had once been meticulously maintained. Weeds had claimed much of it now. Fences leaned. Posts rotted where they met the ground. He moved slowly, pausing often. The air felt heavier than expected. His chest tightened, not with pain but with effort. He considered turning back, then forced himself onward a little longer. This land had been central to his identity. He had measured success in acres, in yield, in the visible obedience of soil and people alike. Walking it now, diminished and dependent, felt like trespassing on his own history. He reached a point where the path narrowed and stopped. Beyond it, grass grew unchecked. He stood there, breathing hard, aware that he had reached a limit he could not negotiate past. Turning back felt symbolic, though he tried to dismiss the thought. On the return, he stumbled. It was not dramatic, no fall, just a misjudged step and a sudden lurch forward, caught awkwardly by the cane. The shock of it lingered longer than the event itself. His heart raced. His hands shook. For the first time, the possibility of collapse felt real. The awareness followed him home, sat with him in the chair by the window, remained with him into the evening. Vulnerability, once theoretical, had become immediate. He imagined being found on the ground, helpless, dependent on whoever happened to pass by. The image unsettled him deeply. He realized then that fear had always been an externalized concept in his life. Something he inspired, something others managed. Now it had turned inward, unfamiliar and unmanageable. There was no satisfaction in this reversal, only discomfort. As his physical world contracted, his internal one expanded in ways he could not control. Memories surfaced with greater insistence, no longer content to drift at the edges. They demanded attention, structure, acknowledgement. He thought about children more often now. Not his own. He had never been particularly interested in legacy, but the children who had grown up under his authority, those who had learned early to read moods, to anticipate shifts, to exist carefully. He wondered what lessons they had carried forward, what habits had followed them into adulthood, what silences they had passed on. The thought that his influence might have extended beyond his immediate control disturbed him. He had assumed that once ownership ended, so did responsibility. Age had a way of challenging assumptions. There were moments when he felt anger at this delayed reckoning. Why now? Why when change was impossible? Why when those affected could not witness his awareness? Could not benefit from it? The question contained its own answer, though he resisted it. Because understanding had never been the point. The realization stripped away a layer of defensiveness he had not known he still carried. He had always believed that intention mattered more than impact, that not wishing harm excused the harm itself. Now faced with the accumulated weight of consequence, intention felt irrelevant. The house creaked as evening settled. Shadows deepened. He did not turn on the lamp. He had grown comfortable in low light. It felt honest, nothing hidden, nothing embellished. He sat with the discomfort, resisting the urge to distract himself. No reading, no writing. Just presence. This too was unfamiliar. He had spent a lifetime filling silence with authority. Now silence filled him. He considered the possibility of forgiveness, not from others that seemed presumptuous, but from himself. The idea surfaced tentatively, then retreated. Forgiveness required acknowledgement of harm, yes, but it also implied release. Release felt unearned. He had lived comfortably while others endured. He had aged while others disappeared. He had retained memory while others had been denied even that. What right did he have to relief? The thought settled heavily. As the night progressed, fatigue returned deeper than before. He shifted in the chair, adjusting his position. Seeking comfort he could not quite find. The body demanded rest. The mind resisted. Eventually exhaustion won. In the darkness before sleep, one final thought emerged, uninvited but clear. He had always believed that consequence arrived as punishment, that it came with noise, with force, with spectacle. He understood now that consequence could also arrive as endurance, being left alive, long enough to understand exactly what one had done, and powerless to change it. Sleep claimed him slowly. The understanding remained. When he woke, it was not to light, but to stillness. The house had a way of holding its breath in the early hours, as if unsure whether the day was worth beginning. He lay there longer than usual, eyes open, listening to the quiet mechanics of his own body. The shallow pull of air, the slow, deliberate release. Each breath felt counted, measured, as though his lungs had adopted the caution his mind had learned too late. Rising took effort now. Not pain exactly, but negotiation. He sat on the edge of the bed, waiting for the room to steady itself. The floor felt colder than it should have, or perhaps he felt it more clearly. Sensation sharpened when strength faded. He noticed that mornings had become the most difficult part of the day. Not because of fatigue, but because waking required acknowledgement. Sleep at least offered temporary absence. Waking meant returning to himself. He moved through his routine slowly, washing his face, buttoning his shirt. Each task demanded attention he once would have found insulting. There was no anger in him anymore, only resignation. The kind that arrives after resistance has been exhausted. He did not look in the mirror often, but when he did, the face startled him, not because it was unfamiliar, but because it looked exactly as it should. Time had done its work honestly. Lines etched deeply, skin thinned, eyes dulled, then sharpened again when memory passed through them. He had expected age to soften him, to dull the edges. Instead, it had clarified. He spent more time sitting than walking now. The chair by the window had become a fixed point, a place where hours could pass without announcement. From there, he watched the land respond to forces that no longer included him. Wind flattened grass. Birds settled and lifted again. Clouds gathered without concern for ownership. There was a time when he would have taken satisfaction in this view. It would have reassured him of continuity, of control extended beyond the self. Now it reminded him of how little had ever truly belonged to him. He thought about death more often, though not with fear. It appeared to him as a closing mechanism, not a threat. An ending to repetition, a release from the constant rehearsal of memory. What unsettled him was not dying, but dying without resolution. He had always believed that conclusions were earned through action. That closure required effort. He had spent his life acting decisively, yet here he was, facing an ending that demanded stillness instead. There were no apologies to offer that would reach their recipients. No reparations he could make that would not feel symbolic at best, insulting at worst. The imbalance was too great, the damage too dispersed across time and lives he could not trace. This helplessness disturbed him more than guilt alone ever could. He found himself revisiting moments where he had come close to questioning himself, only to turn away. The hesitation he had silenced, the doubt he had reframed as weakness. He remembered how easily those moments had been dismissed, how efficiently the system had absorbed and neutralized them. He wondered how many lives might have shifted if he had paused longer in those moments. The thought was dangerous. It led nowhere productive. He recognized that now. Regret, when indulged too freely, becomes another form of self-centeredness. He tried to restrain it, to observe rather than indulge. Observation, he was learning, was all that remained to him. Occasionally letters arrived, notices, updates, communications that required minimal response. He handled them carefully, aware of how fragile his handwriting had become. The letters did not ask anything of him beyond acknowledgement. No one asked for explanation. That absence spoke loudly. He realized that the world had moved past the need to confront him. Accountability had already been distributed, processed, absorbed by systems larger than any single man. His personal reckoning, however intense, was irrelevant to the machinery of progress. This realization did not comfort him, it diminished him. There was a particular afternoon when the weight of this understanding settled heavily. The light outside had shifted suddenly, clouds moving faster than expected. He felt a pressure in his chest that made him pause, hand resting against the arm of the chair. The sensation passed after a moment, but it left behind a clarity that did not. He was not running out of time. Time had already run its course. What remained was aftermath. He thought again of the children, of the ones who had grown up learning to be invisible. He wondered what they had become, whether they had learned to speak freely, or whether silence had followed them into new spaces. He would never know. The thought that his influence might still echo in lives he could not name unsettled him deeply. He had once believed that power ended where his authority ended. Age had revealed how naive that belief had been. Power, he now understood, leaves residue. As evening approached, he attempted to read, but the words blurred. Not from poor eyesight, but from distraction. His mind resisted escape. It insisted on presence. He closed the book and sat instead, hands folded, listening to the house. The sounds were familiar now, predictable. He had learned their rhythms, the way others once learned his moods. There was a bitter symmetry in that. He considered prayer briefly, not out of faith but habit. It had been a tool once, a language of justification. He had spoken words of gratitude for prosperity he had not questioned, for stability built on suffering he had ignored. The words would not come now. Prayer without humility felt obscene, but humility without repair felt empty. He let the thought pass. As darkness settled, he felt a growing sense of fatigue that went beyond the physical. It was as though his mind had reached the end of its resistance. Acceptance, when it arrived, was quiet, not peaceful, simply unavoidable. He had lived believing that strength protected him from reckoning. That age would grant him dignity without demanding reflection. He had been wrong on both counts. Strength had delayed reckoning. Age had demanded it. He shifted in the chair, discomfort radiating through his joints. Pain reminded him that he was still present, still subject to sensation. He welcomed it, oddly. Pain was honest. It did not pretend to be anything else. He thought again of forgiveness, and this time did not reject the idea immediately. Not as absolution, not as relief, but as acknowledgement of reality. Forgiveness, he realized, did not erase consequence. It simply recognized it without denial. Whether he deserved even that recognition remained uncertain. The night grew deeper. Outside, the world continued without him. Inside, his thoughts slowed, settling into patterns that no longer fought for dominance. He understood now that the punishment he carried was not meant to correct him. Correction implies continuation. It was meant to accompany him to the end. This understanding did not dramatize itself. It did not demand tears. It simply remained. He sat there until his body insisted on rest, until the chair felt less like support and more like restraint. When he finally stood, he did so carefully, aware of how close balance had become. In the bedroom, he lay down fully clothed, too tired to undress. Sleep approached hesitantly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Just before it arrived, a final realization surfaced. He had spent his life deciding who mattered and who did not. Age had reversed that judgment without ceremony. Now no one needed him to matter, and he was left alone with the knowledge of how much he once had. The final years did not arrive with warning. There was no moment he could point to and say, "This is when it began." The change was gradual enough to be mistaken for normal aging. The days lengthened. The nights deepened. The body slowed its negotiations with effort and expectation. He found himself sitting more often than standing, listening more than speaking. Silence, once something imposed on others, now settled around him naturally. No one interrupted it. No one rushed to fill it. That alone would have felt strange once. Morning light still entered the house the same way it always had. It crept through the windows, rested briefly on the furniture, and moved on without waiting for acknowledgement. He watched it longer than necessary. Watching had become easier than participating. The house was quiet now, not because it was empty, but because it no longer revolved around him. Rooms existed without purpose. Objects remained where they had been placed decades earlier, serving no one in particular. He noticed how little of it truly belonged to him anymore. His hands had grown unreliable, fingers stiffened without permission. Tasks that once required no thought demanded patience. He resented the slowness at first, then accepted it. The body was simply reclaiming time he had never allowed others to have. In his earlier years, weakness had been something he recognized immediately in others. It had been noted, categorized, quietly exploited. Now it lived inside him, unremarkable, constant, impossible to negotiate with. That irony did not escape him. He rarely received visitors. Those who might have come had long since passed on, moved away or chosen distance. Family connections had thinned over the years, reduced to occasional letters, brief calls that carried obligation rather than interest. He understood why. There had never been room in his life for emotional generosity. Everything had been transactional. Loyalty had been expected, not earned. Respect had been demanded, not cultivated. Now, without leverage, he had nothing left to trade. Some afternoons, he drifted in and out of sleep in his chair, waking without clarity about the day or hour. Time blurred, losing its sharp edges. When he was younger, he had measured time obsessively. Seasons dictated labor, hours dictated control. Now time moved independently of him, and it waited. Memory changed shape in old age. It stopped arriving as scenes and began arriving as understanding. He no longer saw faces clearly. He no longer heard voices in full. What remained was knowledge stripped of detail. He understood without needing to visualize how many lives had been narrowed because of him, how many decisions had been made without consent, how many futures had been quietly closed off so his own could remain comfortable. He had once believed that restraint mattered, that avoiding excess made him different from worse men, that cruelty had degrees, and that he occupied a more reasonable position within it. Age dismantled that belief thoroughly. He saw now that moderation inside an unjust system does not reduce harm, it preserves it. It allows cruelty to continue without drawing attention to itself. That had been his role. He had benefited not because he was exceptional, but because the system was designed to reward men exactly like him. Men who followed rules written for their benefit. Men who did not question the foundation, only their position within it. That realization came without drama. It did not raise his pulse or quicken his breath. It settled quietly like dust. Some evenings he found himself thinking about the language he had used all his life. Words like order, property, discipline, words that had allowed him to distance himself from consequence. He had believed that naming something differently changed its nature. Age taught him otherwise. One night, lying awake in the dark, he acknowledged something he had never allowed himself to consider before, that the people he controlled had understood him better than he ever understood them. They had known what he was from the beginning. Fear sharpens perception. Power dulls it. He had lived most of his life dulled. The doctor came occasionally, more out of routine than necessity. Each visit was shorter than the last. The conversations avoided reassurance. There was nothing to promise, no intervention to suggest. Time was doing its work efficiently. He did not ask how long he had left. The question no longer interested him. Length had lost its appeal. What mattered now was clarity, and clarity had already arrived. He spent long hours alone, not reading, not writing, simply existing. Thought slowed, reflection deepened. He stopped trying to balance his life against imagined alternatives. There was no better version of himself waiting to be discovered. This was the version that had lived. Near the end, something resembling calm settled over him. Not peace. Peace implies resolution. This was acceptance without comfort. The understanding that nothing remained to be argued. He had lived long enough to remove all excuses. There were no final visions, no comforting narratives whispered by imagination. He did not picture forgiveness offered by unseen figures. He did not imagine history softening around him. He knew better. Regret did not feel redemptive. It felt instructional, precise, unavoidable. It arrived not as punishment, but as consequence allowed to mature fully. That was the sentence. On his final morning, he did not wake with urgency. The body felt distant, cooperative only in small ways. Breathing required attention. Awareness narrowed. The room was quiet. The house remained indifferent. When he died, nothing marked the moment. No signal passed through the walls. No recognition followed. The world continued. Later, others would sort through his belongings. His life would be summarized, reduced, categorized, his name placed where such names are placed. History would not dwell on his internal reckoning. It would not reward late understanding, and it did not need to, because the truth was simpler than judgment. Cruelty does not always end in spectacle. Sometimes it ends in memory. Sometimes the punishment is not imposed. Sometimes it is permitted to arrive naturally, through time, through clarity, through the removal of every excuse. He lived long enough to understand what he had done, and that understanding remained with him until there was nothing left to understand. If you stayed until the end, you already know why this story was told slowly. Subscribe for more stories that let time finish its work, and do not look away when it does.